The name of this children's book has always been The Berenstain Bears. This series of books was created by Stanley and Janice Berenstain in 1960. That is, they named it after their surname. The creator's son, in fact, has explicitly addressed this matter, confirming their family name has always been Berenstain. You can read that interview here. This is a good case of word perception, word recognition, bias found in our expectation of commonality, and misinformation distribution. Suggestibility and therefore mismemory make the Mandela effect believers think the spelling was always Berenstain Bears. If we recall what I mentioned earlier in this presentation about egocentrism found in these types of belief systems, one can clearly see it develop in the case of the Berenstain Bears. I say this because we already received confirmation from the horse's mouth. From the perspective of the Mandela effect believer, this, however, is not enough. For they have again this assumed privileged position in the universe where their awareness of change is exceptional and by virtue of that is pardoned from the change. They, as gods if you will, for what's the point of a belief if it doesn't make you feel superior, will insist the Berenstains are the object of a supernatural change, of which they seemingly are not aware, based on nothing but the believer's assertion of change. Once again, we see the Mandela effect believer objectifying others for the sake of squeezing their peg through a square hole, trying to fit their idea and agenda by dismissing the rest of the world as veritable. Now, are you, as a Mandela effect believer, going to insist that their last name changed? You know this without a shadow of a doubt, and the Berenstains are just poor victims of a cosmic shift. Because asserting the book has always been Berenstain, you are also asserting their family name has always been Berenstain, since the book is named after their surname. Your presumption does not perceive the world for what it is. It creates a flimsy overlay, a filter of sorts that makes surreal of the real. Since these are claims of change that involved parties cannot corroborate, they are most obviously superimposed, fictitious ideas at best. You ignore the most reasonable, obvious, and most likely explanation of perceptual error and memory in favor of pretentiously edifying the world through nonsense. Nonsense that you can then use to pontificate and neglect real explanations and real science that we have understood and done pretty well with so far. Overlook all the well-established psychological and cognitive concepts and ideas for a tall tale instead.
It's not my memory. It's not me. Reality has shifted and the name has always been Berenstain. And I'm 100% sure of that because I feel it. I remember it.
Beseeches the believer. Let's analyze why this error occurred in the first place. But first let's make one thing clear. There's evidence Berenstain was used, but definitely not on any official Berenstain book or product ever published or manufactured. In other words, consumers never saw it unless an individual researched copyright records, saw other people's mistaken spelling, or had products with a mistaken manufactured label. We'll see that later. As seen here in the Copyright Office records, there are relatively very little recordations made with the name Berenstain. In fact, there are 11 records shown. There are two reasons explaining why it was recorded this way. First, they have an appointed agent, especially for copyright recordation, who performs the filing. The address is even published as a P.O. Box in Ambler, Pennsylvania. As I mentioned, this is nothing unique or out of the ordinary. Busy, successful creators and writers usually have an agent or manager doing the administrative work. The other thing to note is that they are not even solely Berenstain records, but a mix of Berenstain as well. And indeed, fortunately, gives us another instance of simultaneous evidence and mixed chronology with absolutely no pattern in timing of misspellings. This makes our case of human error or human intent even stronger. Given the public was misspelling the name since the creation of this book, eventually it seems the Berenstain Corporation decided to make a few records and include the misspelling in them, and through the least expensive route. Remember, businesses want to protect their product and ensure full accreditation. But we can also deduce recordation of misspelling was not an ongoing or vastly considered endeavor, since the huge majority of copyrights recorded for this book are all Berenstain, as seen here. A tremendous 175 recordations through the history of this book were recorded using the proper and only spelling Berenstain. Further, no actual trademark, seen here, or corporation registration related to the Berenstain Bears, seen here, demonstrates use of the incorrect spelling, and rightfully so, since no official product or book ever made by the Berenstain Corporation, save for a handful of manufacturing errors, bears any logo spelled Berenstain. An example of manufacturer's error is this VHS tape floating around the internet showing the incorrect spelling on the spine of the tape, but correct spelling on the face label, which the company subsequently corrected. Incidentally, also creating simultaneous evidence. What's more is the implausible nature of residual evidence, as it were, never crosses their minds and so remains as legitimate evidence. Lack of URL claiming also serves as confirmation that Berenstain wasn't considered for full official recordation. Somebody else, as you can see, ultimately got to the domain berenstainbears.com. I am not aware of any reason Michael Berenstain did not recognize the very few instances of Berenstain in the copyright records. Not that he should know anyway. Who the hell goes rummaging through old copyright records? Except for incorrigible investigators. It's not terribly important to me either, since nothing published or manufactured officially by the Berenstain Corporation used Berenstain. And the simultaneous evidence is still proof of human design. The exact reason for this human-made change, who really knows? But it is not supernatural. Certainly not shifting parallel realities. It could have been, as we said, business reasons to protect the product, or maybe if it was work for hire, they made an oversight. Now we can move on to reasons for error. This individual notes in this video Berenstain in articles, TV guides, and other publications for several decades. More about this video in a moment. Now, this surname confusion is also most likely enhanced by how human beings perceive words. We should keep in mind bias and congruity in language is always a factor, and differing states of awareness to hyperawareness dictate dissonance and salience. Things like typoglycemia prove economy in the human's brain of processing language in print. Remember, it'll take shortcuts. Word shape is also another mechanism involved in deciphering language for humans. Syntax preserves congruence when it comes to strings of words. So context is important. If the meaning of a string of words is intact, like a true sentence, so is congruence. Printed words hold congruity when first and last letters are in the right place and the other letters are present regardless of order. This journal covers these aspects of processing words as well as word shape. Quote, when the isolation field is bigger than the word, which happens when the word is far from the center of gaze, the word it can only be seen holistically. We use this, what can be seen holistically, as our definition of word shape. Thus, any two letter strings that are indistinguishable under these conditions have the same word shape. End quote. Words with AI or EI, for example, form the same word shape for the brain. Another study is about how the brain skips information it can predict, such as with words. Actually, our brains do fill in the blanks, especially with familiarity or congruent contexts. For those who insist on concocting facts and broad claims to fit the narrative of this so-called effect, a form of this is called typoglycemia, as mentioned. Marda Kutas is a leading cognitive neuroscientist and the director of the Center for Research in Language at the University of California. She states that humans are very good at reading jumbled nonsense, and context is extremely important. The brain uses context pre-activating areas that correspond to sequence or expectation. Although language and product marketing differ somewhat in terms of congruity, they still share the fact of bias, however, and that congruity and salience are still the brain's goals. For language, commonality and context allow for perceptual incongruity so long as the aforementioned variables are intact. With proper names or surnames, there is a little less space for salience, since although there are common established ways of spelling these names, there are at times small variations. These variations can then be sacrificed by bias for salience. Surnames like Silverstein, Oldstein, Finkelstein, etc. historically established a standard, not necessarily for the pronunciation but for the spelling. The ability to read word shape shows once the brain establishes information, certain combinations such as AI in this case, we may overlook nuance or resolve to a more common combination, and only in a hyper-aware state are we shocked to discover the detail. Think about Berenstain, Berenstain, and Berenstain. Now, if it were the case this was a more commonly established name, like Berenstain, errors arising from its spelling would most likely not exist, or sporadically appear as true typographical error. Now consider the surname, the advent of commonality, and what the brain wants to see, and suddenly we can decipher our important letters, from the more common down to the less common. In this case, B-E-R-N S-T-I-N are the molding letters. Perceiving such surnames, first resolution of E-R-E-N, the brain reconciles with the common E-R-N. So it's no coincidence that Berenstain is the other misspelling of the surname found in the archives. The evidence proves the hypothesis which gives way to implication. Then the letter shapes AI and EI remain and essentially seen as one shape. In a hyper-aware state, they then make all the difference in cognitive dissonance. Suggestibility does not have to come in the form of a trend or fad to have influence. Suggestibility is built into the rules we've created in norms and language. Skeptic about the commonality of the Steen names? Take a look at the surname statistics from forebears of the two prominent misspellings, including the contested name Berenstain versus the correct surname Berenstain. Berenstain has the most popularity with a whopping near 45,000 global incidents. Berenstain, not so shabby at almost 4,000. Berenstain has almost no global incidence of around 92. What's even more interesting is these two misspellings statistically have the highest global incidences with any variation of the BERN sequence, including the BEREN sequence. It's not a coincidence. Just to drive the point home how the three Steen surnames set a standard in how we perceive such a surname, check out their stats. Finkelstein has almost 16,000 global incidents, with Goldstein at almost amazingly 78,000 incidents, and Silverstein at a little over 10,000. Berenstain in truth stood no chance against the bias of what we have come to know as common when it comes to these linguistic patterns of surnames. The BERN and the EIN play a tremendous role in explaining why we had these perceptual errors. We didn't care then because hyper-awareness of the fact was missing. It was missing because nobody made the silly suggestion that realities were shifting, or at least with not such a ubiquitous platform as the lovely internet. Anecdotally, Michael Berenstain also mentions this common issue of people leaning towards the established common ways of spelling and/or pronouncing last names. He goes on to say about his father, quote, "His elementary school teacher said that his name was spelled incorrectly and that she was changing it to Berenstain, and that she wouldn't recognize the spelling of his name in her class because there was no such name. So it goes back pretty far, the issue, and when I was a kid growing up, nobody pronounced it correctly." End quote. There it is, right from the source. It seems insane, doesn't it, for somebody else to tell you how to say or spell your own name? Mandela effect supporters preemptively claim reality shifted somebody's name and life. Yet only they are privy to that, insisting by incredulity these personal details have changed despite the source telling them otherwise. They don't consider the insanity of this behavior. This is right from a Berenstain telling us this perspective bias has always existed and, in fact, afflicted the integrity of their surname most of their life. Suggestibility also plays a part manifested as speech, that is, pronunciation. The way we pronounce words has a profound effect. Throw in the ambiguous stain pronunciation and that further influences the spelling. Sure, visual memory is superior, but when bias from commonality joins a discrepant pronunciation, as in stain, people casually pronounced it based on that bias, ambiguously leading to steen. Affecting auditory memory, confusion doesn't become a question of why, but when. Even among the steen names, there is conflicting pronunciation. Silverstein versus, say, Frankenstein. Goldstein versus Einstein. These compounding reasons are why so many people read a word incorrectly that was right in front of their face. It's not about knowing how to pronounce stain, it's about suggestibility through commonality and how that influences pronunciation and thereby confuses spelling that is once again resolved by commonality, as we just saw. This and the listed reasons are absolutely good reasons many people would still remember it as Berenstain. The average person's communicating of experiences and senses is by reconstruction, not linear duplication. The brain is not a hard drive. Reconstruction is spiked with bias. It isn't a false memory. As I said, that is not probable for a mass group of people at vast distances. It's a memory of false information, biased as the correct memory. Since some did read and write the name correctly, it must have been such. That's what explains some people correctly remembering it as always being Berenstain. There are the exceptions after all. There's always those who are right and those who are wrong. It also explains why there were just as many publications showing the correct spelling as there were the incorrect spelling. Those pieces of evidence, by the way, are glossed over by the Mandela adherents. More on that in a moment. One could even argue some of the Berenstain camp perhaps went off the right track at some point, unknowingly because of suggestibility, seeing and hearing the mistaken spelling so many times. Salience of commonality takes over the rest, and now they know it as Berenstain. Some may ask, why would this perceptual error only occur with select things like the Berenstain Bears? For starters, it is a redundant question. In all matters of life, it's always that something is a certain way while other things are not. To ask that question as rhetoric in trying to say, you see, Mandela effect is real, otherwise why does it only affect like things, doesn't answer anything and only argues from assumption. I think to a reasonable thinking individual, that is no valid response. Second, can anybody really answer that question with that premise? Well, that is the focal question, is it not? Before one has a question to answer practically, the believers assign a grandiose explanation. We can't start with a fantastical premise, then wonder why it relates to some things. That is a loaded question. How does one answer pragmatically an outlandish premise? We can't answer scientifically based on what we know of the brain, so long as we reserve the platform to answer it so. We note explanations of what the brain does relating to perception, its bias, its search for salience, etc. Also, we could ask that question conversely about anything. Why don't we question other day-to-day mismemories? And if we do, why are they not attributed to this ridiculous Mandela effect? In asking this question, the counter-question shows the arbitrary nature of the effect and hints that people question only certain things, even without perceptual error, precisely because of their provocative nature in culture or simple popularity. With a popular children's book, the exposure to what is seemingly a common surname or suffix of it, like Steen, containing a string of letters similar to a common name, the text and print of the book are not center gaze but peripheral. Therefore, we mistakenly pronounce it based on how teachers, parents, etc. convey the title to us early on. Word shape and expectation of commonality based on early introductions to the name, not the letters. Berenstain looks like Berenstain in passing, and Steen is much more common and familiar, as we have all just learned. Commonality influences further, so even if the individual has no prior experience with Berenstain, the suggestion of commonality is strong. For those who want to believe that a child approaches these books with a clean slate and no preconceived notions, which signifies they would have been attentive of this detail, guess again. Clean slate doesn't really have meaning, first off. Secondly, books are things that are introduced to us by older, fallible adults, whether we were read to or it was part of our learning to read experience. And that comes with much bias. There's hardly a clean slate, as it were. There is also the innate mechanism by which children learn how to read. Decoding sight vocabulary and assimilating meaning as part of the experience in early reading doesn't just happen right off the bat. Before children learn to actually use the alphabet, that is, identify things by visual vocabulary, the child's brain instead deciphers meaning by employing a default attachment of visual cues. That's the reason children's books are much more useful with pictures and illustrations. The cover of such books are also, of course, identified through their illustration rather than the words. Let's dive into examples of simultaneous evidence, which by now one should realize the implication. The use of other people's word or their articles are not proof that Berenstain was absolutely in circulation as an officially used version in print. It just shows, like the other examples, that others exhibited the same perceptual error. And no, it isn't just about asking, how can this misspelling occur so many times? Is it really a coincidental typo? But it isn't merely about typographical error. Keep in mind that perceptual error is systematic and goes beyond a trite typo. It's about salience and congruity and the resolutions to which the human brain arrives as a shared basic mechanism. So claiming the evidence of Berenstain goes on, and there are hundreds of examples in the archives, does not undoubtedly prove that used to be the actual spelling and has somehow magically changed. If you want to play that game, then show the multitude of examples where Berenstain is used instead. Why is that fact ignored? It's not to prove definitively people knew the name only one way or the other, but there was conflation involved. It is proof of that, and we can use archival pieces to demonstrate that error. There is no definitive proof of only one spelling because in the overall timeline of these publications, the spellings are mixed up. If not mixed up in the same body of work, then mixed up within the chronology. It's in mixed use precisely because it's an error and conflated, revealed as use of correct and incorrect versions in the same body of work, at the very least, same timing or lacking chronology altogether. I'm truly in awe how they overlook this, how they miss this implication. All I see are people pointing out that Berenstain is found many times in the archives. On top of which, I've seen them go on to state statistics that most of the spelling they remember happened predominantly before a certain time period. We'll see shortly this is not true in the slightest. So I ask those individuals, if you use archived publications, why ignore the fact this convention exists? Why ignore that both surname versions exist in the same articles? Or, if demonstrating an article with solely the incorrect spelling, why not show the correct spelling solely exists as well in other articles of the same time periods? In fact, why not show the second incorrect spelling, Berenstain, which I will show in a bit, that also points to human error and the congruity of more familiar things? Now, Berenstain is not a contested spelling by many people as the stain versus steen is. I understand that, but it's not an empty straw man either. I'm merely showing the volume of error we are dealing with and the extent the error goes. By showing more instances of error, it helps to frame all discrepancies as error. So, it's not a metaphysical shift of realities but human blunder. There's one error and here's another. But Berenstain serves more than just to show another error. As the more familiar, common spelling in that genre of surnames, it is an important element as pointed out about commonality. This surname being even closer to that said commonality. Why not take note of the lack of chronology, which should further confirm that this is all due to human error? To me, it seems these people find what they want to find. They're looking for bias confirmation, not actually investigating objectively. And I am starting to see the thrill in it for them. Here's an example of a video game reviewer referring to it as Berenstain throughout his review, even when the game graphic clearly shows Berenstain. It must have been right in front of his eyes, and yet his bias and assumptions shaped what he thought he was seeing, clearly demonstrating human fallibility. The creator of this YouTube video, as well as the viewers, completely miss this omission of both spelling versions appearing within the same body of evidence, such as a timestamp 3 minutes and 26 seconds. Just glossed right over it. Yet again, another individual inadvertently disproves Mandela effect while trying to prove it. The subtitle reads, "Meet Santa and the Berenstain Bears," while the body text below it reads Berenstain Bears as they perform, almost as if in the same breath. And here is more simultaneous evidence missed as well. First, a still of the example I just mentioned. More simultaneous evidence on the same medium. This was from my bank credit program with Berenstain Bears as the mascot and reading incentive program. This snippet from the Independent Journal from as far back as 1964 shows us simultaneous evidence and how this inadvertence started basically from day one. Here's some not so clear but still legible photos from 1992 of the actual books that say Berenstain, while the caption and body read Berenstain incorrectly. Another example from 2002. In this one from 1981, the TV guide conflicts with a description above it. From the Abraham Lincoln Museum itinerary, this error is found in plain sight. At the Strong National Museum at Play, right there is the picture of the actual book with Berenstain, spelled correctly of course. The text description inputted by a human is Berenstain. And more examples are these catalogued entries from the archives of Quincy Public Library. Day 2 show the simultaneous mix on the same medium of Berenstain and Berenstain. As for the other misspelling, Berenstain, demonstrating the resolution to commonality as error, here are some examples of that. Again, this is just scratching the surface. It's just a couple of article examples of 20 of merely one archive spanning from the 70s all the way up to 2008. Here's one as relatively recent as 1998. Daily Minor from 1990. It is an advert no less with the totally incorrect spelling Berenstain. Even later, this snippet shows the error in 2006. Here is a good example of how an error could potentially be passed on to children from parents. The father in this article from 1989 mistakenly states that the Berenstain Bears is a book read to his kids. In 1998, this article discusses people confusing musician Leonard Bernstein with the Berenstain Bears at a performance, a great example of showing the resolution to a common, familiar surname. More typical confusion with the common Bernstein. Another from 1985 and one from 1990. Here are tons of examples showing the correct spelling having coexisted just as much, if not more, than the incorrect spelling before 2000. And here are just some examples showing that Berenstain was still being propagated by some people post-2000. So we have 171 results with the incorrect Berenstain post-2000. we have 209 results between 1979 and 1989, all showing Berenstain. 350 results between 1960 and 1999, all Berenstain as well, about 14 additional mixed-up times. I've mustered up here 573 examples of the correct spelling being used before 2000, and 171 post-2000. Needless to say, most of the spelling after 2000 is correct, naturally, since by this time more and more people became more aware of the actual name, or simply technology is helping us along. We clearly destroy the absurd notion of any presumptuous convergence point of the Mandela effect. You see, if you skew the research in just the right way, as many of the Mandela folk are, you can easily create the appearance that there was some magical conversion point where reality had shifted, where it all went from Berenstain to Berenstain. But this in fact is not the truth at all. My research suddenly adds a missing perspective that grounds our conclusion. That YouTube poster is also the individual who attested to the bias statistics. She stated there were hundreds upon hundreds of articles that were claimed to be before 2000 that spelled it Berenstain. Yes, there are, but by ignoring the other articles that also existed in those time periods, of course, it makes it look as if it has always been Berenstain. This is undeniably false. It's unfathomable this is getting by most people, that it's considered good investigating. If you ignore evidence, the simultaneous evidence, whether in the same time period or right there on the same page, if you ignore the multitude of errors, the mixed-up use of all spellings, lack of chronology, you only present a portion of the story. You in effect produce a surreal scenario, since now one can bend the facts to fit the agenda. In many of these researchers' results, I notice this characteristic. It's either an anecdote, a flimsy article or two with no argument to back it, or a decent body of evidence, but biased only to show one aspect of the story. The truth, let alone the truth about the evidence, is not relevant to a belief. Something like Mandela effect thrives on exploiting obfuscation. I can't help feel that they are in some way being intentionally deceitful, or maybe their judgment is so clouded since they too want to believe desperately. Another thing to consider that reveals human error is the keyword function for most newspaper archives. This is an interesting and hidden clue. One must remember that it is a human after all that creates tags and connects keyword searches to the articles. The newspapers are scans, therefore they are not digital text easily searchable by a common keyword search string, such as a browsing search engine. So it's curious to note individuals who set the relationships between keywords and the respective article or section of the paper, occasionally were either confused or aware of the historical error. How do we know this? Because at times using a variation or a popular incorrect spelling of a keyword, if it has proven to have any at all, will come up in the search. This undeniably reflects the fallible mind at work. It explains why some searches for Berenstain bring up articles that contain Berenstain and vice versa. More commonly, I hear many Mandela effect believers, such as the poster of that video, raise the question, how could so many people, professional journalists in this case, all make the same error in spelling it Steen? Well, so far we have learned how it comes to be. But also, let's not forget, people, including journalists, are just as inclined to bandy misinformation since they too are influenced by pop culture waves. And this convention will also apply to some other examples we will go over. No journalists, as far as we know, at that point in time, set out to understand why, understandably so, this discrepancy of spelling exists, let alone think about it.